Keeping the military prepared and ready won't mean anything if they can't turn their computers on. A new report from the Association of Defense Communities and Converge Strategies highlights the importance of protecting America's electricity grid when it comes to the country's military readiness. The report includes a framework for defense stakeholders to understand electric grid risks in their regions and explore national defense opportunities that a stronger transmission infrastructure backbone presents. For a glimpse into that, Federal News Network's Eric White spoke with one of the report's authors and a principal at Converge Strategies, Will Rogers.
So, why don't we just lay out what exactly this report was looking at and what the main mission or purpose of it was?
Sure. Well, I think when people think about the military's energy needs, they often think about how we get our fuel to troops over there, wherever over there it might be. But I think, as you know, your viewers know, the Department of Defense is increasingly a globally networked force. And a lot of those missions that are supported over there, they start right here at home. It's communications that are supported for special operations forces in the field, offensive or defensive cyber operations, drones used for active surveillance or to provide operators on the ground with defensive overwatch. A lot of those operations, they start at domestic military installations, or they're supported from domestic military installations, and they're critical missions that require assured and uninterrupted power. And I think a lot of people will think of DoD as being fairly energy resilient, not being easily disrupted to power outages. We've seen in recent years it's had a lot of work to invest in on-site bases or on-site microgrids, power generation, and energy storage. DoD has, I think, done a good job of getting out some of those shining examples. Perhaps the most famous is the Marine Corps Air Station Miramar, former home to the Navy's Top Gun School, which touts its ability to go completely off the grid for 2 weeks with enough electricity and fuel to support flight operations. And while every installation should strive to be like Miramar, the reality is that most are not, and they depend on the commercial power grid to support the critical missions that I was just describing before. In fact, most domestic military installations rely on the commercial grid to support their critical defense work, 99% of defense installations. And so when the power grid goes out, the Department of Defense's mission suffers. And so our work was really to help articulate the national defense importance of investing in a more resilient and a more reliable power grid that starts outside of the military installation but has huge implications for our ability to conduct warfighting and to support the national defense. Even if military installation has backup power, most of the folks who support those critical missions on base, they live out in the community that might be dark. 2/3 of the troops and their families and all the defense civilians who live out in the community, we're asking them to be the best versions of themselves when they come to the installation to support critical missions, but they may be worried about their family members who are without power, who are relying on essential services, that things like banks, grocery stores, and schools. And when that, a power outage may be a nuisance for 8 hours, but when you're talking about a day or several days, which we've seen in recent years, that can really do a number in terms of the morale on the force and on the defense civilians who we are asking of them to forget and to ask a lot of them to be able to come and do critical missions. And so national security, starts at home, and those defense communities that rely on power to do their mission are critical to accomplishing our national security objectives.
Yeah, I was wondering if we could expand a little bit on the current status of things and where things currently stand and what you all found. How many defense communities have actually experienced issues like that? And again, you don't have to give me the exact number, but is it widespreading? And you mentioned that they should all be striving to technically be off the grid, but just about how doable is that? I know I threw you two questions there, but I figured that I figured that one hand would wash the other on the answer here.
Well, I would say that to your latter question, yes, I think every military installation is striving to have enough on-site backup power and energy storage to support critical missions. But that's really only one piece of the energy resilience coin, if you will, because as I said, all of the troops and their families and defense civilians, they live in the community. All those on-base resilience measures, they don't really do anything to help support people living in the community. So you really have to do both. You have to support on-base resilience, and you have to make sure that the department is working with state and local governments to ensure that we're doing everything that we can to support a more resilient and reliable commercial grid that's going to help to make the defense communities that support the department even more resilient in the future. In terms of where we're seeing outages, I'll say one is too many. In terms of the number, I think anytime there's an extreme weather event in this country that's impacting a state where there is a heavy defense presence, we're seeing outages that impact military families and defense civilians. I think the most acute example of this is going back to Winter Storm Uri that impacted Texas, where you saw 12 of the 15 Department of Defense installations in the state of Texas go without power for several days. And, there were millions of people in the state of Texas that were without power. And there were tens of thousands of military families that were that were deeply impacted by that in defense communities. And so what we're trying to do is make sure that these kinds of instances don't happen again by ensuring that the department is front and center working with defense communities to invest in a resilient, reliable grid that's going to help to support the national defense mission.
We're speaking with Will Rogers. He is a principal with Converge Strategies. So let's get into the actual report itself. You did this in conjunction with the Association of Defense Communities. So obviously they hear the thoughts and concerns of the folks who actually live there. How did you all go about gathering this information? Were there interviews or surveys conducted? And who was involved from all parties?
Yeah, so the Association of Defense Communities, they've been huge champions of their constituencies. They obviously are well tied in with their community network. And I think they've been a huge launching pad for us just to get the word out that the Department of Defense actually has a huge stake in the outcomes of building out a more resilient and reliable grid. We've been doing this work for several years now, actually in partnership with the Association of Defense Communities. The report that we're talking about today, Unleashing the Grid, Energy Dominance for National Defense, is actually the second in a series of reports that we've done with the Association of Defense Communities. The first report we put out last year, Transmission Expansion for National Defense, or TREND, really started to elevate at a high level the national defense importance of the commercial grid and bringing defense community stakeholders into the conversation. So the department has already done a number of things to start to work with defense communities through the Office of Local Defense Community Cooperation to invest in using grants to improve critical infrastructure where some of those critical infrastructure shortfalls are impacting the military mission. And the Association of Defense Communities works hand in hand with those state and local governments to make sure that those grants are well positioned to effectuate the outcomes that the Department of Defense has in mind. And we've been capturing some of those stories about where the department needs to expand that work to capture the broader benefits of investing in a resilient, reliable grid is going to have for the military's warfighting mission. And I'll say that the Association of Defense Communities has been a great champion, not only for amplifying this work, but also to make sure we've got broad reach in getting defense stakeholders and their voices into the planning processes that need to be represented in the broad swath of transmission planning conversations. The department, I think, has done some work to date to try to get involved in this work. But ADC, that Association of Defense Communities, I think is doing a lot more work to try to encourage defense stakeholders at a local level to not be shy about articulating what its current defense requirements are, what the electrical loads for those defense requirements are, and what the future requirements might be. So that as we're talking about building out a more robust and reliable transmission grid, the Department of Defense is not missing out on being part of that planning process.
Yeah, if this is such a high priority, as you said, and I mean, it makes sense, right? You want to make sure that everything is all up and running, whether you're on the commercial grid or your own grid. What has been the major roadblocks for defense facilities as far as getting to a point where they have enough backup power or are off the grid completely themselves? Are there regulatory issues there, or is it a technical capabilities issue? Which channel does it fall under?
Yeah, I would say sometimes it comes down to awareness. Most installations, they have assumed for a long time that assured access to power is just something that they can rely on. And I think a lot of senior military leaders assume that power is going to be something that they're going to have when they need it, and it's not going to be a hindrance to their mission. And I think making sure that they realize that the past is not prologue, that we're seeing increased pressure on the electric grid, whether that's because of extreme weather that's becoming more frequent and severe and it's causing outages that are longer in duration and time, or we're seeing huge demand growth on the commercial grid from new customers like AI data centers or semiconductor chip manufacturers that are increasing the demand on the grid from 3 to 5% a year when in previous years, demand on the grid was relatively flat or at most 1%. And that puts a lot of pressure on utilities to be able to deliver reliable electricity for customers like the Department of Defense. And until senior leaders understand that this is a dynamic that's changing and they need to be a part of the conversation, otherwise they're going to miss out. I think that it's relatively important for the defense leaders who have a ton of priorities. And I don't begrudge them about not making this a priority when they didn't think they needed to. But I think now is the time to, as we're educating senior leaders, to not miss the chance to be part of this planning process so that energy is front and center as a core requirement of the department, just as other requirements need to be as part of the national defense mission.
Yeah, and it's also a defense facility, right? So that means there are certain sensitivities that it's not just weather they got to worry about. Having your own grid would go a long way towards protecting, if we were ever in some sort of military dispute with any one country, that they don't go around us and